Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Loom Press Poetry Podcast. Today, with us, we have Jessica Traynor. Uh, and if we just have a look at the back here. So, Jessica Traynor was born in Dublin in 1984, is a poet, essayist, and librettist. Is that how we say it?
Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Yeah, I had to Google that word because I wasn't sure. But you write opera music, is it, or singing, or kind of vocal?
I have, yeah, I have undertaken a few commissions before that have kind of moved me in that direction, which has been really fascinating and interesting. But it was also not a world that I knew a lot about before I kind of plunged into it.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Have you been doing anything in that field there recently, or?
No, not so much. I think the last one I did was in the summer of 2022 when I worked with a theatre and choral composer called Tom Lane and a dance artist called John Scott, who runs a theatre dance company called Irish Modern Dance Theatre. And we did a piece together called The Wanderer, which was part of Cork Midsummer Festival. So that was really interesting. There was a lot of different genres coming together. So it was quite exciting, but also a bit terrifying.
Very good, yeah. So, yeah, I suppose. Well, I know you're very passionate for music, and so I just for anyone watching, I happened to bump into. It was actually crazy. I bumped into Jess randomly in the middle of an LCD sound system concert. Uh,
Yeah,
I
places where people might find me if they're looking for me, find the nearest LCD sound system concert, and I'm probably there.
yeah, yeah. How did you find it in the end? I'm sure you thought it was amazing.
Yeah,
It was.
I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it. I was really sorry to miss Young Fathers, because I've seen LCD Sound System many times, and I have a kind of a middling interest in idols, but I really would have liked to have seen Young Fathers, but unfortunately,
Yeah,
between kind of getting the kids home and fed and put to bed and the babysitter in place, it just wasn't going to happen. I think when I booked the concert, I was saying to my friend who I was there with that I thought it would take place in 2007, when I could go to gigs midweek for like 5 p.m.
yeah. I know. Yeah, it's.
Yeah.
But I was sad that I missed Young Fathers. I missed Shit Robot as well. Who I actually like them. But I did see I caught the tail end of Idols, and since then I didn't know of them before. They're actually incredible. Like they don't have I don't think they have a
Yeah.
bad song. I've been listening to their whole discography there. But anyway, we're rambling. So yeah. Anyway, Jess's debut collection, Liffey Swim, came out from was published by Deadless Press in 2014. And also her second collection, The Quick, that was came out in 2019. And this is your third collection, Pit Lullabies.
Yes.
Uh, and that'll be the focus of this podcast today. But before we get into Pit Lullabies, maybe you can tell me a bit about Jess Traynor. How did your poetic journey begin? I always like asking people about the how it starts for them, you know.
Yeah. Well, I suppose I kind of fell in love with poetry at a very young age. My granny had had 7 children and had to leave the civil service, as soon as she got married because of the marriage ban that was in place in Ireland until 1973. So, trained for the civil service, managed to work for about 25 minutes, then got married, had all of these kids. But after my mum, who was the youngest of the 7, had gotten to a kind of a certain age, where she could take care of herself a little bit more, my granny went back and trained as a speech and drama teacher. And she used to work in a lot of the schools in Dublin, particularly in the inner city. So I know some people. I worked in theatre for a while, and I would meet some people who were in places like Sing Street, schools like Sing Street, and that some of them would remember my granny having come in to teach them a bit of speech and drama. And because she did that, now by the time I was born in the 1980s, she was well retired. But she still had a lot of the speech and drama primers, and they had lots of little kind of rhymes and bit snippets of poetry in them, that I would come across. And little poems like Antigonish and I Do Not Like Thee, Dr. Fell, these kind of strange, eldritch, uncanny little rhymes. And there was something in the atmosphere of those that really struck me. And there was something kind of spell-like about them, something slightly mysterious. And I think I carried that over into primary school when we started doing poems like Walter de la Mare's The Listeners and Robert Frost poems.
Yeah.
Poems like that, which managed to tell a very big story in very few words and that are really, really rich with atmosphere. Um, and there was something that struck me in the kind of magic of being able to take a huge, huge subject that could be worthy of a, 100,000 word novel, and then try and just open a little window into that world through
Mm.
the small box that is a poem, the little room that is a poem. And something about that kind of stayed with me. And then when I was a teenager, we had to do all of the usual stuff. I think a lot of it's probably still on the curriculum. Like we did Elizabeth Bishop, who is, I think, a really great poet to start teenagers off on, because the poems themselves are quite accessible, I think, on a surface level, but they are full of reference from a certain time and place and context that you can unfold if you want to. We also did some of the metaphysical poets. We did John Donne, who I think everybody hated, but I loved, because I was really keen on this idea again of the world of reference that exists beyond the immediate lens of the poem, and that you can go into and explore, and find your own level of understanding. So I think for me, like, some of the things that maybe dissuade people or put people off poetry were the things that actually drew me to it. The sense of not necessarily always understanding 100% of the poem, but being able to access a certain feeling or an emotional response, or a kind of an associative response, an imagistic response, that would be set off in my own mind. So I started writing terrible poetry myself when I was a teenager, and kind of kept at it. I think during my college years, I did English with history for my undergraduate degree. And I think I kind of set the poetry aside a little bit at that stage. And I actually think that happens to a lot of people, even if you're lucky enough to be able to go on to third level. And you're so overwhelmed by the reading list and the very big change, I feel, in Ireland between the way you study literature in secondary school and the way you're supposed to
Mm.
understand it, at undergraduate level. It's a completely different way of interacting with the text. And yeah, I so for a couple of years I didn't really do a lot of it. And then I kind of thought, well, actually, this is what makes me happy. So I try to go back to it. And I was very lucky in that, I was probably one of the last generation who my route through undergraduate and postgraduate courses was relatively easy, because it was the days before Susie grants or anything like that. I just qualified for a grant for both my undergraduate and my master's. So I mean, obviously I still had to work I worked like two part-time jobs during my master's to be able to pay my rent in the Celtic Tiger years in
Mm.
Dublin, when rent is not as bad as it is not as bad as it is now. Was not as bad as it is now, but was still pretty expensive.
Yeah.
And yeah, but the actual there were the financial barriers to actually studying at undergraduate and postgraduate level were much fewer. So I was kind of able, after my English and history undergraduate, to do a creative writing master's. And actually, I had been planning to focus on theatre while I was there. I'd been working part-time in a couple of different theatres around Dublin. And during my master's, I was working part-time in both the Abbey Theatre in the box office and the Project Arts Centre in the box office. Those were my two part-time jobs. Sometimes I would pick up the phone and say, hello, Project Arts Centre, and then remember I was in the Abbey, which was very confusing for everyone. But yeah, I was able to kind of go and do that creative writing masters, and I hoped it would be around playwriting. But Frank McGuinness, who was the playwright who was working in UCD at the time, had to take a sabbatical that year for health reasons. So there was no playwriting focus, which meant that I kind of had the opportunity to go back to poetry and really concentrate on it very seriously, and kind of made the realization that actually it was my kind of deeper passion. And it was something that I thought that I would always do, that I would always write. And maybe now was the time to try and take it seriously. Um, so yeah, that was kind of my route into it. And then when I finished my master's, or just before I finished my master's, I was lucky enough to get like the last decent arts job going in Ireland before everything fell off a cliff into the recession. And I got an admin job in the literary department of the Abbey Theatre, which meant that I was working with playwrights, in really, really fascinating ways, like doing everything from kind of calculating royalties for plays to negotiating commissioning contracts with agents to sweeping the floor in the workshop room to giving feedback to incredibly high profile playwrights. So I was able to kind of exist and immerse myself in the world of the theatre. Um, but all the time that I was doing that, and actually it was that immersion in the world of the theatre that really convinced me that playwriting was not for me, because it's just so hard. It's so
Yeah.
hard. And it's such a huge it the kind of the financial outlay of putting a play on is so massive in terms of all of the different aspects and elements and moving parts of that just makes it harder. It's harder to get a new play put on than it is to publish a book of poetry if you um, put them solely on a kind of a financial basis. Now, obviously, the theatre world is better funded because it costs more, but still, that sense of publishing a book of poetry will cost somebody this much. It's probably a smaller risk than putting on a play which could cost 60 grand. Probably
Yeah.
that's probably conservative.
Yeah. That
So
was
yeah,
actually, sorry. Yeah.
sorry.
No, go ahead. Sorry, I could have crossed you there.
Mm. I was just really going to say that kind of was how I got into it, and I was working away on the poems while working in this very exciting but really demanding job in the Abbey. And I kind of had worked my way up over the course of about a decade. I was in the Abbey, and by the end of that time, I was literary manager, so I was running the literary department. Which was wonderful and really exciting, and there was a lot of travel, and there was a lot of being involved in the kind of artistic decisions in the theatre. An incredibly fulfilling job, but also really demanding. Um, my first book was published, I think, 3 years before I left the Abbey. Um, and really, when the time came for me to leave the Abbey, my aim and ambition at that stage was to try and pivot myself into a place where I could be a poet full time. And being a poet full time is always about so many more things than just publishing books. You've got to get some teaching practice under your belt. You've got to be able to run workshops. You've got to be able to take on commissions like the opera ones that we were talking about at the beginning of the podcast. Take on pretty much anything that comes your way and that piques your artistic interest. So there's a lot of kind of feeling the fear and doing it anyway involved in it. But yeah, I've been now freelance since 2020.
uh, that's incredible though. Wow. And that was actually going to be one of my questions because I obviously you're working in theater. I was going to ask, did you ever feel tempted to write a play? But then I suppose you answered it there uh, yourself, I suppose. Yeah. But were you ever tempted or considering it at any stage, maybe? Or
Yeah, I mean, I did dabble early on, and kind of I had written like a monologue piece that was put on in a kind of a new playwriting festival down in Tipperary. And then the wonderful Louise Lowe, who runs a new productions, she did a kind of a wonderful treatment of it, and it was put on in the Limerick Fringe. And I mean, I think it was probably a decent piece of writing, but I don't think it was a decent piece of theatre writing. For many of the reasons that I learned then from 10 years of working in theatre, that, a lot of plays that get put on are decent pieces of writing, but they're not actually good pieces of theatre.
yeah.
Um, so that's an interesting thing to look at. But I suppose when the time came to write the libretti, the librettos for the operas, That was kind of, I suppose that was an interesting challenge because one of the bigger ones that I did was a project called Paper Boat that was supposed to be part of the Galway Capital of Culture project in 2020 and then was obviously postponed because of COVID. And it was finally put on in 2022. But that was a really big project with music from and Irish National Opera. And it was supposed to be put on in St. Nicholas's Church in the centre of Galway. And the commission was to create something that kind of honoured and reflected the history of Galway City, but that also was suitable for families. And the model for it was a Noah's Flood, the opera by Benjamin Britten. And I kind of had another world or another life. In that through my teenage years, I was part of a choir where we would have sung a lot of Benjamin Britten and a lot of other kind of contemporary music like that. So I had a little bit of knowledge of Benjamin Britten's work, and I had a little bit of knowledge of this particular opera that had been written. But obviously the challenge was, okay, we have to tell a story um, through music,
Mm.
and it has to be suitable for families. It has to honor Galway, has to honor the history of this wonderful church in Galway. And what I ended up doing was I thought to myself, okay, I have the composer is a wonderful composer called Elaine Agnew, who I'd worked with on a song cycle project with Poetry Ireland a few years previously. And I had actually sung some of her settings of poetry to music in my own choir years before. So I was kind of aware of her and knew her by the time we came to work together on this project. But I knew that she was quite happy for me to write in poetry. And for her then to set these poems music, and obviously then we would talk about whether things scanned properly and what might need to change, and if certain things were going to be too long when they translated into music with different repetitions and refrains and things like that. But there was also, I wanted to create some dialogue in the opera as well, and some spoken parts, and a kind of an avatar of sorts for the audience. I wanted this whole opera to take place in this church, and you're not really sure whether you're in the past or the present, but there's one person in the church who is kind of voicing our thoughts in that regard. So I think my knowledge of theatre allowed me to create something that was workable in that sense because, I had a little bit of a sense of the way that operas work, in that you generally have a chorus of some kind. And you would have the same thing in much of classical theatre, so you have people and they're speaking and there's dialogue and there are monologues and soliloquies, but then there's also often a chorus who's saying this is what is happening, for the audience's benefit. And obviously in contemporary theatre you can't get away with that so much, but in opera it's quite expected. So I think the fact that I had been hanging around a theatre and thinking a lot about the mechanics of plays for a really long time helped in that regard. And I'm not sure I would have been able to do it without that prior experience. So yeah, not traditional playwriting as such, but yeah, it's
Yeah,
certainly been, it's been
theatrical anyway. Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
You never know. I'd say now if you might surprise yourself. One day you might write a play. You never know. It could be could turn out great.
Who knows?
No. Anyway, we'll maybe look a bit at pit lullabies. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
so yeah, it's striking. There's a lot going on in the collection. There's kind of a mix of like themes of motherhood come up. We see kind of issues with the environment. It's all there's 10 lullabies, and each
Mm-hmm.
lullaby kind of deals with a different sort of aspect. Like I said, like the early poems, the first few they kind of look at the theme of motherhood. And I think so. Am I right in saying that you were the time that this was published, you had just become a mother, I presume. Because just thinking on motherhood and having a child and a baby, was it that kind of inspired the idea of kind of having lullabies and presenting the poem through these lullabies? Was that the kind of gist there, or?
Yeah, I mean, I think that yeah, I mean, it was definitely a lot of the collection was inspired by the experience of becoming a parent, but also the experience of going back to work and sometimes having to um, be away from your child, my work involves a lot of travel. Now, not like hugely glamorous stuff, but for example, there's a sequence in the middle called An Island Sings, and that's the song cycle that I was referring to a minute ago that I wrote and that was set to music by Elaine Agnew. And that particular commission, I suppose a lot of the poems kind of coagulated around that, to use a horrible verb. But yeah, so I was commissioned by Poetry Ireland and by Chamber Choirs Ireland to write a sequence of nighttime songs that would be performed by four different choirs from around Ireland who would come together in the National Concert Hall and sing the songs. So the interesting thing, I suppose, about working with choirs is that you go off to meet them all over the country, but they practice in the evening. So, it's winter, you're traveling by night, you're coming home by night, or if you're staying over somewhere, I'd be getting up at the crack of dawn to get back. So I could be there with the baby because, I was kind of coming to the end of my maternity leave, but not quite back to work yet. Um, so it was an interesting time. And there's a lot of internalized guilt we feel about being away from our kids. And, there's a huge amount of pressure from society for mothers to spend all of their time with their children, which might be a surprising thing. And if somebody had said that out loud to me before I had children, I would have said, I don't really think that's the case. But I now think it is very much that there's this kind of strange idea that the only happy child is a child that's constantly glued to one of its parents, particularly the mother.
Mm,
And that's just complicated and difficult. And even if you don't believe it, it's very hard not to allow that sense of like guilt to creep in when you're away, when you're traveling away from your children, particularly when they're young. So while I was writing these kind of nighttime poems for this song cycle, I found myself exploring nighttime and motherhood and all of these anxieties, which are very existential. I think until you either have children yourself or become very invested in somebody of a younger generation. I don't want to say that only parents have empathy for the next generation. I feel like it's anybody who has any investment or connection to younger people who are going to inherit the world that we leave and the society that we leave. And suddenly all these fears that felt quite existential are not really existential anymore. They are real and actual fears. And I found myself struggling with a lot of that, with the darkness and the worry, and the kind of the weight of all of that, and also all of my own anxieties about being a good enough parent, which I think very, very common for people to worry about that.
mm,
um, and so I found myself, when I think of those early days of parenthood, there's a lot of darkness. Now, a lot of that was just about being up all night with a baby that wouldn't sleep, as many babies won't. Um, but yeah, the kind of the darkness of that, I think, got into the work a little bit. And I found myself at some point with the collection thinking to myself, okay, I want there to be a sequence of poems scattered throughout this collection that really delve into the real darkness of that, the kind of internal and external darkness. Um, and that try to reflect, in a sense, the durational nature of what I experienced, in terms of things like postnatal depression and all of those anxieties that I was speaking about. I didn't want to kind of sandwich those things together in one sequence in the book. I wanted to spread them out because it wasn't a straightforward chronology. It wasn't a sense of, well, I felt a bit glum and then it went away.
mm,
There were often times in life where you are going through something, um, and you're not feeling that thing all the time, but it's there and it kind of ebbs and flows.
mm,
Um, so yeah, so I started writing these poems, and as I went on with them, I kind of had a bit more fun and became a bit more experimental with them. Because I kind of wanted to create the sense that if you're in a dark space in life, whatever that is, sometimes it's not simple enough as it's not as simple as somebody just chucking down a ladder and out you climb out of the pit. A lot of the time you kind of have to say to yourself, okay, this isn't going to get better overnight. So I need to make myself comfortable here and rearrange the furniture a bit and just inhabit the space and see what I can do here. And I actually think that is probably what's going on in the later poems, which kind of hint towards some sort of, I don't want to say a resolution, like the last poem in the book is not a pit lullaby, it's just a lullaby. So I don't want to suggest, rosy fingered dawn has appeared and everything is fine. But there is a kind of a sense of reconciliation with the self. The pit lullaby poems are all addressed to my eldest daughter. But really they're not about her, they're about me, you know. But I think in order to be kind of reconciled with your relationship with a child, you have to be reconciled with yourself.
Mm.
So those poems are, I suppose, a journey towards that attempted kind of reconciliation where you have the ability to offer your child a lullaby of sorts. Yeah, I hope that
Yeah.
answers the question.
No, it's yeah, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I saw when I began reading it, like the first poem, I think let me just see here. Yeah, the first poem, I'm probably not pronouncing this right. Megalodon?
Megalodon.
Sorry, Megalodon, yeah. And that's a am I right in saying that that's a big sort of a sea creature? Yeah. So
Yeah, it's a prehistoric shark. You
mm,
sometimes see their enormous jaws in museums. I think there's one in the Natural History Museum in Dublin, which unfortunately now
yeah,
I think closed for renovation again.
yeah,
But yeah,
yeah.
they're very striking things.
Yeah, so that like if you read this poem, it sort of reads as it's well in my view I took from it that it's like the theme is kind of conception,
Mm.
and then like there's this insane imagery of the comparing like the woman to the this this prehistoric shark, this creature, and then it kind of then from then on the other poems kind of move on to like the like in the birthing room we have the child is born and like nourishing the child and going on and Ophelia in Ballyboe. Am I saying that right? Ballyboe,
It's actually Ballybock, yeah, but you wouldn't
Ballybach,
be the first person. You wouldn't be the first person to call it Ballybow. I think Ballybow makes it sound a lot posher than it is.
Ballybach. Yeah, is it? This is Storm Ophelia. Right out.
Yeah, yeah.
Did you actually? Were you like walking your child out through Storm Ophelia, or is that just like kind of hyperbole? Or
No, I didn't go out that day. One of the things that a lot of the early poems are informed by, well, first of all, just to kind of speak to the kind of the megalodon imagery a little bit. I kind of was struck in early parenthood and in childbirth and by all of those experiences by how close birth and death are.
oh yeah.
And I mean, that's obvious. As soon as anybody says it, everyone else is going to nod. But I think there are times in life when we really feel these things. And for me, my particular situation uh, was not an easy birth, and everything was fine in the end.
Mm.
But it was hard not to be aware of the fact that maybe 100 years earlier, I might not have survived, and neither would my daughter. Now, 100 years earlier, a lot of other things might have been different, but it was a thought that lodged in my brain. So when writing that Megalodon poem, I suppose I'm trying to just tie those things together in a way that goes or continues throughout the collection, and just the kind of visceral nature of it all. We know that childbirth is a visceral process, but we don't really talk about that a lot. We just talk about the delightful, baby wrapped in the beautiful pink or blue baby grow afterwards and covered in talcum powder, and all of the grime and sweat and blood is all kind of washed away, literally erased. But in the early days of parenthood, like there are, maternity leave is a wonderful thing and it's fantastic, but there is this weird sense, I feel, in Western society that, you've had your baby, now go and sit on your own with your baby for 6 months. I mean, who wants to do that? That's just,
Yeah.
it's cruel and unusual. And, there's mother and baby groups and there's all these other things, but like, if you can't get your baby out of the house because you're so disorganized and everything's, it's just, it's a really weird time. So every day I would just go out with the buggy and walk and walk and walk for as long as the baby would put up with it. Because that's how I felt like I was a human being. So the day that Storm Ophelia hit, I remember my partner had gone back to work, but he was at home that day. I think everybody was sent home. And about three times I said, I'm going out. He said, no, you're not. I said, it doesn't look that bad. But we were in Ballybock, which is about a 5 minute walk from Fairview Park. And the next day when I went out, like loads of trees had been blown over and everything.
Yeah,
So I was by that, but I was also intrigued by the idea of women and madness, and how Ophelia is portrayed as kind of slightly
yeah.
inexplicably insane in Hamlet.
Mhm.
And I think the kind of the deep misogyny of that depiction, which is just, why is she mad?
Mm.
What
Yeah,
exactly has happened there? It's just, I mean, and I don't really want to call Shakespeare a massive misogynist, because I think he gave us some of the most wonderful and insightful portrayals of women in early modern and even up to contemporary literature. But he got it badly wrong
yeah,
sometimes. And there's a lot of the Ophelia stuff, which I suppose has just become slightly more opaque with time. All of the stuff about wildflowers and their meanings. But I very much found myself in those early days of parenthood paying minute attention to any of the wildlife that I could see in the area of, kind of North Inner City Dublin, where I was strolling around, and out into Fairview Park, which is, not the most biodiverse place, but, there were Brent geese and kingfishers, and I would see an otter in the Talca sometimes, and I would notice things. I had the time to pay minute attention to things, and I did find myself kind of saying, "Oh, there's the winter aconite has started blooming," because I'm a nerd and I like, you know, I like plants. So yeah, I kind of found myself paying that close attention, having that day where I couldn't go to that space, feeling, at least 25% more insane, and then going out the next day. But it was quite interesting. About a couple of months later, yeah, so this was like, it was September when my daughter was born, and then the following March, I think we had the Beast from the East, and I did go out with the buggy in the middle of the Beast from the East,
geez,
and
you're a thrill seeker. My God, like,
I know,
so
yeah.
dangerous.
Yeah, it was actually lovely. I mean, the
Yeah.
buggy did get slightly stuck in the snow outside the local garage, but I managed to wheel her out. Said to my partner, we need briquettes. So I went to the local hardware store in Fairview, which is gone now. It's a place called Edge's Hardware. It was there for like 100 years, and it was the only place open. And it slung a big bale of briquettes in the bottom of the buggy, and then immediately realized I could no longer push the buggy over the snow.
Oh my God. Jeez.
But yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. That's my, when I first read the title of the poem, Ophelia and Ballylock, I immediately thought of Ophelia from Hamlet, because I have leaving certs that I teach, and they were doing
Oh
Hamlet
yeah.
this year, and yeah, I know what you mean. That kind of portrayal of Ophelia, because she just, I suppose, her father's killed, and then Hamlet says he doesn't know her anymore, and then she just kind of loses her mind, and it's kind of like just kind of saying that she's sort of not able to deal with, you know, trauma
Yeah.
and her emotions,
Yeah. I just find Lady Macbeth's madness so much more convincing and, kind of understandable. I find her character arc so much more interesting, I suppose.
yeah,
Going from having been the person who is completely driving all of this bloodshed to being the person who actually can't cope with it. Yeah, I kind of find myself more, I mean, plot wise, I'm more interested in that trajectory as
yeah,
well. I find the fainting victim a little bit hard to get on board with,
yeah. I don't know. Maybe Shakespeare, he was just a man of his time. Maybe, I don't know.
Oh yeah, and it's
Yeah,
allowable. It's allowable.
yeah. Now look. Anyway, but I'm just conscious of the time. We're coming down to 5 minutes. Time flies when you're having fun. But maybe you'd I don't know if there's any particular poem. Maybe you'd like to read one of the I know I'm gonna say it right again. Say it. Megalodon.
I know, yeah. Megalodon, I think. I
Megalodon. That's
think
it.
I could be
Megalodon.
getting it wrong. Yeah,
Megalodon.
sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Megalodon. In gaping mandibles, the hypnotic interplay of hinge, hole, the sharpened frill around the brink, What will be left of us is these spaces, thresholds, holloways, paths worn in chalk, releasing Jurassic plankton to a summer's day. The dish of my pelvis I've served to lovers, opened for my child. These prehistoric jaws, this entry, exit, and all that thrashes in its teeth.
Thank you, Jess. Yeah, it's a wonderful poem, but it's also terrifying as well.
Good,
So
good.
you did a
Yeah,
good
I
job
like
there.
that. I like that. I
Um,
think we need a little bit more fear in poetry. You know,
yeah, yeah,
it can't all be celebratory and lovely.
exactly. There's other thing. I know we're conscious of time here. We do have just under 4 minutes, but bone is a key word. I noticed bone crop up a lot throughout the poems.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe you could elaborate a bit on the symbol of the bone throughout the different poems.
I mean, I suppose I just think it's fascinating. There was an image that kept coming to me after I had my first child, which was, and I think it's another image that I use in one of the poems, of a wire kind of stripped of its casing, and this idea that somehow having a child had robbed me of my defensive layer, you know, my protection from the world. And there was a sense that I had become completely porous and had no way of protecting myself anymore, emotionally, I suppose. And I think after everything is stripped away, what's left is bone. And that, I suppose, outlasts us in a very interesting way,
Mm,
but also is something that should not be exposed. And I think this is a book about many parts of myself and my kind of emotional core that were left very exposed for a certain amount of time. And hopefully are a bit more protected now. But yeah, getting to the bone of things, you know, getting to the core of things in a way,
yeah,
I
yeah.
suppose.
No, I like that. Yeah, I like that idea. Um, uh, Maybe as well. We just because we only have a short time left. Maybe you could read the last poem, Lullaby, at the end of the book,
Absolutely.
just for the audience to hear.
Perfect. Lullaby. I have a lullaby for you at last, so lie beside me, hold my hand, follow me through the night's amber lens to Bull Island. Here the seals are waking from their sleep, rolling into the surf where in blue black they'll stretch the land ache from their muscles. Here the only touch is water, moonlight on scale, dazzle of bubbles, blubber's cape and fish blood's meager warmth. These are my notes, the strand, our stave. Our music rises and falls. We are waveform. We are sea.
You're a lovely reader.
Oh, thanks. Thank you.
Lovely reader,
It's
yeah.
taken me it took me a while to get over the nerves of it all, but
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, yeah, no, you're great. That's what I think T.S. Eliot said. He's like, we need more good readers in poetry, you know.
do you
So
know,
yeah.
I've been to a fair few poetry readings where it sounds like it's the liturgy being read, you know? So I
Mm.
kind of, I think we need to get away from that kind of Yeatsian flatness.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
my
yeah.
guiding principle is to stay away from that if I can.
Very good. Well, thanks a mil anyway, Jess, for coming on the podcast, and it's been great
Oh,
talking to you.
thank
And
you.
I'm sad I kind of didn't get more time to kind of go into more of the. There was so much. It's actually quite a large collection compared
Yeah,
to some of the other poetry pamphlets that you'd read, you know. But
yeah.
anyway, congrats anyway on your success. Hopefully, we'll see more from you in the near future.
We
And
will indeed. Yeah.
okay, well, thanks for coming on, and have a good evening, Jess. Okay,
Thanks so much for that, Lee. Take care.
thank you. Bye bye.